You found hair on the pillow, on the shower drain, on the brush. You counted them and wondered whether that was more than yesterday, whether the number had crossed some line you could not define but could feel. You tilted your head under the bathroom light and checked the crown, the temples, the pout line. You asked your barber, your physician, the internet, and everyone said the same thing. It falls out, it runs in the family, and there is nothing structural you can do about it. Hair on the pillow did fall out, but not because the follicle died. The follicle that produced it is still embedded in your scalp, still anchored in the dermal tissue, still connected to the blood supply that feeds it, still cycling through growth and rest phases the way it has since before you were born. What happened to that follicle is more specific than falling out and more reversible than most people realize. It shrank. The thick, pigmented terminal hair it produced for decades, the hair with enough diameter and pigment to be visible, to provide coverage, to look like hair, has been replaced, gradually, cycle by cycle, by a thinner, shorter, lighter hair. And that thinner hair was replaced by a thinner one still, each successive cycle producing a shaft with less diameter, less pigment, and less length than the one before it. The most recent output from that follicle may be something so fine it is invisible to the naked eye. But the follicle produced it. The follicle is still there. It is still cycling. You just cannot see what it produces anymore. This process, follicular miniaturization, is what hair loss actually is, and the physics of why it happens in a specific pattern that is identical across millions of men, why the top thins while the sides remain thick, why the crown disappears while the back stays full, follows the anatomy of a structure under your scalp that most people have never heard of. The pattern of hair loss is a map, as precise and reproducible as any anatomical diagram, an identical horseshoe shape appearing across every ethnic group, every body type, every continent, wherever testosterone and time converge on a single scalp. The map matches the anatomy precisely. What the structure is, how it creates the pattern, and why the follicle responds to mechanical input through the same transduction pathways that maintain bone and muscle. That is the physics the second half reaches. Now, the cycle itself is the first piece of the mechanism. Every hair follicle on your head operates on an independent clock. Anagen, the growth phase, lasts 2 to 7 years, and during anagen, the matrix cells at the base of the follicle divide rapidly, producing the keratin protein that forms the hair shaft and pushing it upward through the skin at approximately 1 centimeter per month. The rate is remarkably consistent. The variation between individuals is less than 20%, and a single follicle produces hair at a consistent rate across its entire growth phase. What varies is the duration of the phase itself, and that duration is what determines the maximum length your hair can reach. 7 years of continuous growth at 1 centimeter per month produces hair that can reach 80 centimeters. The length limit is not a property of the hair shaft, it is a property of the anagen clock. Catagen, the regression phase, lasts 2 to 3 weeks and represents the controlled demolition of the lower follicle. The matrix cells stop dividing. The lower portion of the follicle collapses upward toward the skin surface, shortening to roughly 1/3 of its anagen length as the cells that form the hair bulb undergo programmed apoptosis, a genetically choreographed sequence of cell death that dismantles the productive apparatus of the follicle while preserving the dermal papilla and the stem cell niche in the bulge for the next cycle. The hair shaft detaches from the blood supply at its base and becomes a club hair, a dead shaft anchored loosely in the remnant of the follicle. Telogen, the resting phase, lasts approximately 3 months. The club hair sits in the upper follicle, anchored by friction and the shape of the root, while the follicle prepares the dermal papilla for re-entry into anagen. When the new cycle begins, the new hair growing from the base pushes the old club hair out through the follicle opening. That hair on the pillow was a telogen club hair, a hair that completed its full cycle and was displaced by its replacement growing beneath it. At any given moment, 85 to 90% of your scalp follicles are in anagen and 10 to 15% are in telogen, with the remainder in the brief catagen transition. You shed 50 to 100 telogen hairs per day as normal turnover. The system cycling exactly as designed, each shed hair already replaced by a successor growing behind it. This is not hair loss, this is hair replacement. Hair loss begins when the clock changes. In androgenetic alopecia, the anagen phase shortens with each successive cycle. As Whiting documented in dermatologic clinics, tracing the progressive reduction in growth phase duration across sequential follicular cycles in affected scalp regions. The diagnostic signature of miniaturization is a shift in the anagen to telogen ratio. A healthy scalp shows 85 to 90% of follicles in anagen at any given time, but a miniaturizing scalp region may show 60 to 70%. More follicles resting, fewer growing, the clock running faster through shorter cycles with longer proportional rest periods. A follicle that spent 5 years in anagen during your 20s spends 3 years in your 40s, then 1 year, then months, then weeks. Each shorter anagen phase produces a shorter, thinner hair. The shaft had less time to grow, and the matrix cells were less active during the shortened window. With each successive round, the follicle itself physically shrinks. The dermal papilla, the cluster of specialized mesenchymal cells at the very base of the follicle that acts as the command center for the entire cycle, becomes smaller with each successive round of miniaturization. The papilla is what determines everything about the hair the follicle produces: its thickness, its length, its pigmentation, its growth rate. A large papilla with a robust blood supply. A dense network of capillaries wrapping around and penetrating the cell cluster, delivering oxygen, glucose, amino acids, and growth factors to the matrix cells above, produces thick, pigmented terminal hair. A small papilla with a compromised blood supply, fewer capillaries, reduced lumen diameter in the remaining vessels, lower perfusion rate, produces thin, unpigmented vellus hair. The relationship between papilla size and hair quality is so direct that dermatologists can predict the hair's characteristics from the papilla's dimensions on biopsy. A papilla that has lost 60% of its volume will produce a hair shaft with a proportionally reduced diameter. Terminal hair becomes intermediate hair, becomes vellus hair, the near-invisible peach fuzz that covers a child's forehead and a bald man's crown in equal measure. The bald scalp is not empty. It is covered in miniaturized follicles producing vellus hairs too fine to see, alive but throttled. Hair transplant surgery proves this point from the opposite direction. Follicles removed from the sides and back, the Galea-free zone, and transplanted to the top continue producing thick terminal hair in their new location for life. The follicle carries its donor region characteristics with it. But the fact that miniaturization occurs in a geographic pattern identical to the Galea's footprint, and that follicles from outside that footprint resist miniaturization even when relocated into it, raises the question of whether the environment the follicle inhabited, not the follicle itself, was the primary variable all along. If you have noticed your hair thinning over the past decade, the part line widening, the scalp becoming visible through hair that once covered it completely, you have been watching miniaturization in progress, cycle by cycle, each hair slightly thinner than the one it replaced. Testosterone circulates through the bloodstream to every follicle on the scalp, delivered by the arterial network that supplies the skin, arriving at follicles in every region at roughly equal concentrations. At the follicle, an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase, present in the dermal papilla cells and the outer root sheath, converts testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, a structurally similar androgen with a single chemical modification that changes its biological potency dramatically. DHT binds to androgen receptors on the dermal papilla cells, with 5 times the affinity of testosterone, occupying the receptor for longer, triggering a stronger signaling cascade, and initiating the downstream changes that shorten the anagen phase and begin the miniaturization process. The conversion is local. It happens at the follicle itself, not in the bloodstream, which means the concentration of DHT each follicle experiences depends on 2 factors: how much is produced locally and how quickly the local blood supply removes it. The question most explanations stop before asking: testosterone reaches every follicle. 5. Alpha reductase is present in follicles across the entire scalp: crown, temples, sides, back. DHT is produced everywhere, in every region, through the identical enzymatic pathway. Why does miniaturization happen only at the top, crown, and temples, and never at the sides and back? Both regions have androgen receptors. Both produce DHT through identical enzymatic conversion. Both are exposed to identical circulating testosterone concentrations. The standard explanation is differential androgen receptor sensitivity. The follicles on top are genetically programmed to respond more strongly to DHT than the follicles on the sides. This is the established model, supported by decades of research, and it describes the hormonal mechanism accurately. What it leaves unanswered is the deeper structural question: why would follicles that develop from identical embryonic tissue, carrying identical DNA in every cell, express different receptor sensitivity based exclusively on their geographic position on a single scalp? Identical genome, identical hormone, different outcome, determined entirely by location. Something about the local environment at the top differs from the local environment at the sides. The difference is not hormonal. The hormone is identical in both regions. The difference must be structural, mechanical, or vascular. Every man who has ever looked at the horseshoe pattern in the mirror has been looking at a map. Maps require geography, and while the hormone is the trigger, the geography is the unanswered question. You now know what happens. The follicle shrinks, cycle by cycle, driven by DHT binding to the dermal papilla, each round of miniaturization producing a thinner hair from a smaller papilla with a shorter growth phase. The question changes from what happens to why it happens in a map. Why that specific horseshoe pattern, top gone, sides preserved, appearing with identical geography in millions of men across every population on Earth, regardless of diet, climate, or lifestyle? The answer is mechanical, and it sits under the scalp in a structure most people have never heard of, creating the regional difference in blood flow that transforms a uniform hormonal signal into a geographic pattern. Beneath your scalp, a structure called the Galea aponeurotica spans the top of the skull, a dense, fibrous, inelastic sheet of connective tissue stretching from the frontalis muscle at the forehead to the occipitalis muscle at the back and laterally to the temporalis muscles above the ears. The Galea exists as a tendinous bridge between these muscles. When you raise your eyebrows, the frontalis contracts and pulls the Galea forward. When you tense the back of your scalp, the occipitalis pulls it backward. The Galea transmits force between the two muscles across the dome of the skull, and the chronic resting tension these muscles maintain keeps the Galea taut even when you are not actively moving your scalp. People who habitually raise their eyebrows, clench their jaw, or carry tension in the forehead and occipital muscles increase the baseline tension in the Galea, and the follicles beneath it experience the compression continuously. It is a biological helmet of tough fascia, thinner than a credit card but remarkably resistant to stretching. The collagen fibers are arranged in a cross-hatched pattern that distributes force in multiple directions, creating a sheet that withstands the pulling forces of the scalp muscles without deforming. The blood vessels that supply the follicles on the top of your head must pass through this taut sheet to reach the skin above it. The arteries penetrating the Galea through small openings in the fascia, compressed by the surrounding tissue as they transit. You can feel the difference yourself. And if you are reading this with access to your own scalp, the demonstration takes 10 seconds. Press your fingertips on the top of your head, over the crown, and try to slide the scalp over the bone beneath it. The scalp barely moves, perhaps 2 or 3 millimeters in any direction before the Galea reaches its limit. Now press your fingertips on the side of your head, above the ear, where the temporalis muscle sits beneath loose areolar tissue. Slide the scalp. It moves freely, a centimeter or more in any direction, the tissue mobile and elastic under your fingers. 2 regions separated by less than 10 centimeters on your own skull, with fundamentally different mechanical properties, and the follicles in each region inhabit those different environments for your entire life. Now, look at the pattern. Hair thins and disappears on the top, the crown, and the temples, exactly where the Galea stretches tightest over the skull. Hair remains thick and permanent on the sides and back, exactly where the Galea is absent and the scalp tissue is loose, well perfused, and mobile. The baldness map and the Galea map are anatomically identical. The evening I mapped this on my own scalp, pressing the crown, then the tissue above the ear, feeling the taut resistance give way to free mobility in a distance of centimeters. The correlation between what my fingers felt and where my hair had thinned was immediate. The geography was not random. It followed the anatomy of the structure my fingertips were pressing against. Chronic Galea tension may compress the blood vessels supplying the follicles in the Galea-covered region, as Choi and colleagues published in Archives of Dermatological Research in 2020, proposing the mechanical hypothesis. Reduced perfusion means reduced clearance of locally produced DHT. The hormone is still produced at every follicle through the standard 5-alpha reductase pathway, but the blood flow that would normally carry the DHT away from the follicle and into the general circulation is restricted by the compressed vasculature. DHT accumulates to higher concentrations in the tissue under the galea, not because more is produced there, but because less is removed. The regional difference in DHT exposure, created by the regional difference in blood flow, drives the regional difference in miniaturization rate. This hypothesis is not mainstream consensus. The established model attributes the geographic pattern to intrinsic genetic differences in androgen receptor sensitivity between follicles in different scalp regions, and that model has substantial evidence supporting it. What the Galea hypothesis adds is a mechanical explanation for how genetically similar follicles might develop different receptor sensitivity over time. Chronic exposure to higher local DHT concentrations, upregulating androgen receptor expression in the affected follicles, creating the sensitivity difference that the standard model observes as an endpoint. The anatomical correlation between Galea coverage and hair loss geography is precise. The maps overlay with a fidelity that anatomy alone explains. Scalp blood flow is measurably lower in Galea-covered regions than in Galea-free regions in every study that has measured it. But the full causal chain, Galea tension producing, reduced clearance producing, DHT accumulation producing miniaturization, has not been confirmed through intervention trials, demonstrating that releasing Galea tension reverses the pattern. The physics is consistent with the anatomy and the perfusion data. It is the mechanical layer that may explain why the established hormonal mechanism produces a specific geographic pattern rather than a diffuse one. Present it as what it is, a hypothesis with strong anatomical support and plausible physics, awaiting definitive causal evidence. Well, the dermal papilla at the base of each follicle is mechanosensitive. It responds to mechanical signals from its environment: pressure, stretch, shear force from blood flow, compression from surrounding tissue, through identical transduction pathways to those bone cells used to detect loading and that muscle fibers used to detect contraction. Mechanotransduction is the physics of converting a mechanical input into a biochemical signal, and the dermal papilla uses it to calibrate its growth output to the mechanical environment the follicle inhabits. When blood flow to the papilla is adequate and the surrounding tissue is mobile, conditions that allow the papilla to experience regular mechanical stimulation from scalp movement, muscle contraction, and pulsatile blood flow, the growth signals are strong, the anagen phase is long, and the hair produced is thick. When blood flow is restricted and the surrounding tissue is rigid, compressed under a taut galea, encased in progressively dense fibrosis, the mechanical input the papilla receives diminishes, the growth signals weaken, and the anagen phase shortens with each cycle. Standardized scalp massage, 4 minutes daily of mechanical stimulation applied through the fingertips directly to the scalp, increased hair thickness in participants with androgenetic hair loss, as Koyama and colleagues demonstrated in ePlasty in 2019. The mechanism, mechanical force applied through the skin to the underlying tissue, stretches the dermal papilla cells, activating mechanotransduction pathways including Want beta-catenin signaling, the specific pathway that drives hair follicle stem cell activation and promotes the transition from telogen resting phase back into anagen growth phase. Want beta-catenin is not unique to hair. It is one of the fundamental developmental signaling pathways in the body, governing cell proliferation, differentiation, and tissue regeneration across multiple organ systems. In the hair follicle, its activation by mechanical input tells the stem cells in the bulge region that conditions are favorable for growth. The dermal papilla requires this mechanical input to maintain its function, the way bone requires loading to maintain density, and muscle requires contraction to maintain mass. The galea, by restricting scalp mobility and compressing the vasculature beneath it, removes that input from the follicles it covers. And then, chronic restriction of blood flow produces a second cascade that accelerates the damage. Local tissue hypoxia, insufficient oxygen delivery to the follicle and the tissue surrounding it, triggers an inflammatory response. The body's standard reaction to hypoxic tissue is to send inflammatory mediators to the area, and in the scalp, this produces chronic low-grade parafollicular inflammation, a sustained inflammatory environment around the follicle that is visible on scalp biopsies in the majority of men with pattern hair loss. The inflammation does not resolve because the cause, restricted blood flow through the compressed galea, does not resolve. And chronic inflammation triggers fibrosis, the deposition of dense collagen around the follicle, replacing the normal soft connective tissue with scar-like tissue that is less elastic, less permeable to blood vessels, and more compressive. Fibrosis makes the miniaturization self-reinforcing. Reduced blood flow triggers inflammation. Inflammation triggers collagen deposition around the follicle. The collagen further compresses the follicle and its remaining blood supply. The further compressed supply delivers even less oxygen, which triggers more inflammation, which deposits more collagen, which tightens the compression another increment. Each revolution of the feedback loop narrows the space the follicle occupies, measurable in the progressive thickening of the parafollicular collagen sheath on sequential scalp biopsies. The follicle that began with a mild reduction in perfusion under the Galea ends, after years of this feedback loop, encased in a dense sheath of fibrotic tissue that restricts blood flow regardless of systemic blood pressure or cardiovascular health. The follicle is gradually strangled not by the hormone alone but by the inflammatory response the restricted blood flow created. The fibrosis is the scar tissue of chronic, low-grade, perfusion-driven inflammation that the Galea initiated. Prostaglandin D2, a lipid mediator of inflammation, is elevated in bald scalp tissue compared to haired scalp, as Garza and colleagues identified in Science Translational Medicine in 2012, confirming that the inflammatory environment of the miniaturizing follicle is measurably different from the healthy follicle. The inflammation marker correlates with follicle size. The more miniaturized the follicle, the higher the local prostaglandin D2 concentration, suggesting that the inflammatory burden increases as the fibrosis progresses. The fibrosis this inflammation produces explains why hair loss accelerates over time. The early thinning is slow, mild perfusion reduction, minimal fibrosis. The dermal papilla is still functional enough to produce intermediate hair. The later stages progress faster because the feedback loop has had years to tighten. Severe fibrosis, severely restricted blood supply, the papilla shrunk to a fraction of its original volume, producing only vellus fuzz too fine to see. Well, this acceleration is why early intervention matters more than late intervention, and why the spectrum of miniaturization determines what mechanical input can achieve. A follicle in early miniaturization, still producing visible hair, the part line widening but the scalp not yet fully exposed, the dermal papilla retaining most of its original volume and its capillary network partially intact, responds to mechanical input because the papilla's mechanotransduction pathways are functional and the tissue surrounding the follicle is soft enough to mobilize. Early miniaturization is thinning. Thinning is responsive. Advanced miniaturization is different. A follicle that has been producing only vellus hair for years. The dermal papilla severely atrophied to a fraction of its original volume. The parafollicular tissue replaced by dense fibrotic collagen. The capillary network collapsed to a remnant, maybe beyond what mechanical stimulation alone can reverse. The fibrosis is too dense to mobilize with fingertip pressure. The papilla is too small to generate meaningful growth signals even if the mechanical input reaches it. The stem cells are still present. They survive even in severely miniaturized follicles. But the infrastructure required to support their activation has been too thoroughly degraded. That spectrum, from responsive early miniaturization to refractory advanced atrophy, is why I began the 4 minutes every morning at the first sign of thinning rather than waiting until the pattern was established, not as vanity, as mechanotransduction, delivering the input the dermal papilla requires through identical physics to what maintains every other mechanosensitive tissue in the body. The window for mechanical intervention is widest when the miniaturization is earliest, when the part line is widening, but the scalp is not yet exposed, when the hair at the temples is thinning, but the follicles underneath still retain enough papilla volume and vascular supply to respond. Anyone concerned about hair loss patterns should discuss their specific situation with a dermatologist. The hormonal, genetic, and nutritional dimensions of androgenetic alopecia extend beyond the mechanical layer. The mechanical analysis covers, and a physician can evaluate which factors are contributing to an individual's pattern. When 4 minutes of scalp massage mobilizes the Galea over the bone beneath it, 3 mechanical effects operate simultaneously. The stretching of the Galea temporarily reduces the compressive tension on the blood vessels passing through it. The arteries that were compressed as they transited the taut fascia experience a wider lumen during and immediately after the massage, increasing perfusion to the follicles and improving both oxygen delivery and DHT clearance from the tissue. The increased clearance reduces the local DHT concentration the dermal papilla is exposed to, addressing the accumulation that the restricted blood flow created. Mechanical force transmitted through the tissue to the dermal papilla cells activates the Wnt beta-catenin mechanotransduction. The massage triggers directly. The physical stretching of the papilla cells deforms their cytoskeleton, initiating the cascade without requiring any chemical intervention. The papilla cells do not distinguish between mechanical input from natural scalp movement and mechanical input from deliberate massage. The transduction pathway responds to force, regardless of its source. And the sustained mechanical input disrupts early-stage parafollicular fibrosis, the collagen deposits that have been tightening around the follicle with each inflammatory cycle. Fascial mobilization breaks adhesions in connective tissue throughout the body. An identical principle operates in the scalp, where repeated mechanical input can progressively loosen the fibrotic tissue that has been strangling the follicle's blood supply. Hair thickness increased measurably after 24 weeks of daily massage. 6 months of consistent mechanical input producing changes in the output of follicles that had been miniaturizing for years. The blood flow increase begins with the first session. The Galea stretching temporarily widens the compressed arteries, and the increased perfusion is measurable with laser Doppler flowmetry within minutes. The mechanotransduction activation begins with the first press. The dermal papilla cells deform under applied force and initiate the Wnt beta-catenin cascade within seconds of receiving the mechanical input. The fibrosis disruption accumulates across weeks and months of repeated input, each session applying force to the collagen network surrounding the follicles, gradually loosening the adhesions that have been compressing the blood supply. Every follicle under the Galea was alive. They were progressively strangled by a mechanical structure that compressed the supply line feeding them. The miniaturization was strangulation, not death. The Galea created the environment, restricted perfusion, elevated local DHT, mechanical rigidity, and the follicles responded to that environment by reducing their output cycle by cycle until it became invisible. The map was never random, it was anatomy.